All right. Well, Ian, once again, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
Yeah, definitely. So, just like last time, tell people where they can find you and like how they can get in contact with your with the stuff that you do.
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. My handle is IGHAWORTH. You can also find me on YouTube. I have a daily podcast called The Ian Haworth Show. So you can find me any of those places. I have links to everything. So check me out anywhere.
All right, definitely. I know you best through Instagram, and I watch your YouTube channel through your website. But yeah, that's really cool. It's really cool. So if people can't tell by now, you were on here before, but you're also an Englishman. You're from what? I don't think I asked you last time. What part of the UK are you from?
So from the southeast. I'm from a town about 30 miles west of London.
Oh, okay. Okay, I didn't ask that before. So all right. So because I know isn't there some beef between like the north and the south?
I think there's some beef in one direction. I think every person I know from the north, ever I meet, kind of throw me some shade for being from the south, and it's like, okay, it feels very one directional.
Okay, you care less, but they care deeply.
It's like one of those things that sort of I think people in the south are kind of over it.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me because I have to be honest, I am not very knowledgeable when it comes to the UK and the way the government works. I know a little bit about like the parliament, and then my friend was just telling me, he's like, dude, you got to pay attention to the European Union and things that go on there because I hear it's not very good, especially for the people, not only in the UK, but in Europe in general. Like it's not good for them at all. At least that's what he was trying to tell me.
Yeah, I think so most people will hear about the European Union in the context of Brexit, which was a pretty controversial referendum vote that was held in 2016. So the EU is a originally kind of economic group that morphed into a political group as well of over 20 countries across Europe. And it really became a kind of hugely overgrown bureaucracy that had its tentacles in every single part of European life in a lot of ways. And so people sort of generation upon generation kind of grew tired of that if they remembered what things were like previously. But there's a big divide when it comes to Brexit because a lot of people, my generation, maybe a little younger, maybe a little older, grew up with the UK being part of the European Union. And so there's this definite sense of kind of status quo, fear of the unknown. And so that's really cut a huge divide. The result of that referendum has cut a huge divide in the society in the UK, which I always, when I speak to people, I always kind of liken it to the divide that was caused by the 2016 election in the US.
Okay.
So the way, whether or not you voted for Trump and whether or not you voted for Brexit can really affect you in your social life, which is quite surprising for something that should just really just live in the political realm.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. Which obviously it didn't. If you voted for Trump, it did not go well for you.
Yeah.
Depending on which part you live in. If you live in the echo chamber, then who cares, right?
Mm-hmm. Everything's fine every day.
Yeah, exactly. I'm right about everything. But okay, so let's go back a little bit and explain how does the parliament work as far as is it kind of like our Congress here, or is it a lot different? 'Cause I know you guys have the Queen and stuff too. So exactly how does the governmental structure there work?
So there's not really the system of checks and balances in the same way. I guess the simple overview is there's the House of Commons, which is made up of members of Parliament. These are the people that each constituency will actually vote for. Okay. So, for example, the area I'm originally from, the UK, their member of Parliament is Theresa May, who is soon not to be the Conservative leader and Prime Minister. And then you have the House of Lords, which is made up of peers who are usually there for life, and they're elected either through, they're not democratically elected, they're really suggested for their positions by the Prime Minister or people in kind of higher echelons of politics. Then you have the sovereign, who is Queen Elizabeth II right now. She's really a figurehead. One of her official roles is to basically sign off on rules going through, but that's really a formality. All of the actual lawmaking goes on in the Houses of Parliament. This is where it's kind of similar to the US, where you'll have a bill that's put forward, you'll have some back and forth, you might have some amendments, you'll have debates, and then if both houses support it, then it can move forward. Sometimes you'll have bills die if it doesn't have support from one or the other. So I think there are some similarities in terms of there are certain houses, but I wouldn't say it's exactly the same. I think you don't have the same kind of checks and balances as you do. I think that's something that's very unique to the US and very, very powerful, even though it doesn't really exist in the same way as it used to anymore, which is very sad.
No, it doesn't. I think the president has way too much power now. I think the judiciary branch has way too much power.
Yep.
And I feel like a lot of people the political system is just, you just go with your political party these days, but that we're not talking about US, we're talking about Britain. So it seems like in some ways, like at least they get to vote people in. But then after that, like it gets kind of dicey after that. Right. So
I think this is where the idea of Brexit was really kind of a challenging one, because the UK is supposed to be a representative democracy where you elect your representative and then they have a mandate for whatever policies you voted them in for to pursue. The issue with Brexit was that it kind of went against the kind of common way of doing things, where they presented a question to the general population. So most of the time you will vote in either your Conservative representative, your Labour, who are on the left representative, or some of the smaller parties. And then they will usually go after a certain set of policies which are consistent. So, for example, Labour, because they're on the left, will be much more supportive, extending welfare, for example. Whereas Conservatives might be trying to restrict that a little bit. You've got other parties which tend to be more one-issue parties. You've got the Green Party, who are really their main concern is climate change, that kind of thing. I wouldn't say it gets dicey once they're in, but you have this problem that you have with all politicians, where what you vote them in for isn't necessarily what you get out of them. And people seem to have a very, very short memory for the failures of politicians, where they accept failure over and over and over again, and kind of every time it's going to be different this time. And there's really no way of holding people accountable beyond elections. But when your choices aren't great, it doesn't leave you with much opportunity for change.
Oh, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, I know. Everyone's like, oh, that's not it's a universal problem, unfortunately.
Yeah, we won't go there. So like, how does like the Queen, how does she play into all of this?
So really, she's a figurehead more than anything right now. I think one positive for the monarchy, at least if you have a good monarch, is that it's provides a sense of stability, which you don't have if you have politicians going in and out. So we have Theresa May as Prime Minister right now, but there's quite a lot of thrash because they're trying to, the Conservative Party are electing a new leader of the Conservative Party. I'll come back to that in a little bit, because there is a difference between the president and the prime minister and how they're elected.
Okay.
But in terms of the Queen, now she really is just a more traditional figure that is there as a kind of consistent representative for the country, which then allows you to develop better relationships with countries if you have the same person across the board who doesn't actually have any significant power. It's kind of a good combination. You have someone who isn't hugely influential in the political realm, but is hugely influential in the cultural or kind of relationship area. Okay. So I think it's a good system. I think it's a good system for the UK. It fits in traditionally. I don't think it necessarily works elsewhere. It also is very dependent on the monarch you have. So I think Queen Elizabeth II has been one of the rare monarchs in that she's been hugely a positive figure for the UK generally. But then you look at other monarchs who haven't been quite as successful. I mean, I have some pretty significant concerns about Prince Charles, who's next in line, for example. So I think people tend to focus very much on the system and laud the system of the monarchy, when really they should be lauding who is the monarch and then taking into account whether or not the monarchy is a good system. Because if we had a bad monarch, who I think Prince Charles will turn out to be one, then suddenly that system is going to be very antiquated and doesn't really provide any positive benefit to the country.
Yeah, okay. And like, is there anything that the people could do to get rid of him, or because it's a monarch, you just got to deal with it for that time?
I'm pretty sure that there are some. I'm sure there are some laws buried deep in a book somewhere in Parliament that allow them to force a monarch to abdicate, but I'm sure it would have to be a pretty outrageous reason to do so. I don't think it could be just because they don't really like him. I think it would have to be calling for calling for people to be murdered or anything like that, or doing ridiculous things that haven't really happened in our lifetimes. Thankfully, I think that would be hilariously unlikely. But you never know. Trump is president. Anything goes.
The whole world has changed with Trump.
But there are no rules anymore.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, that's good. All right, so that's essentially the way. So you really just have like the parliament, and then you have the monarch, who has more of a cultural influence and a political influence.
Yeah, certainly not a. I mean, she has political positions in that she'll meet with the prime minister, I believe, once a week. She is responsible for opening each session of parliament, but a lot of these are very much kind of figurehead positions. She couldn't just click her finger and say, "Okay, and we're going to war with this person today," or anything like that.
So she's not like absolute power type of monarch that in history we've typically seen. So like, what's going on with the Conservative Party and this prime minister? Like you mentioned that earlier. Like what's going on with that? Like how's that?
Okay. So to go back on my earlier point of the difference between the president and the prime minister, just to give some context, the prime minister isn't voted for in a separate election as the president is. You elect your representative, and then the prime minister is usually the leader of the most influential party. So most of the time, that's one of the two largest parties, which is the Conservative or the Labour Party. Sometimes you might have to have a few parties join into a coalition to get enough votes in Parliament. But usually the prime minister is the leader of the most influential party. So with that comes the issue that the person who is the prime minister may not have been originally kind of voted for. In the, say, the leader of the Conservatives was David Cameron previously. And when the Conservatives won, people were kind of voting for their representative, but also voting for him as prime minister. But now, when Theresa May became prime minister, she became the leader of the party without an election that came previously. So it kind of gets into this situation where we've had multiple prime ministers recently. I mean, Gordon Brown was one, for example, for the Labour Party, who came after Tony Blair, who no one actually voted for as prime minister. So in terms of what's going on right now with the Conservative Party, they are basically having the comeuppance of completely butchering Brexit for many years in a row. Theresa May has done a pretty appalling job as prime minister, with her one role really being to deliver Brexit. And so the entire Conservative Party is in quite significant turmoil. She's effectively responsible for the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, which is something very, very concerning to see. And so they are in the process of electing the next leader. They whittled it down, I think, from 5 candidates. They're now down to 2. Boris Johnson, who I'm sure people have heard of in the US. He tends to be one of the people that is most recognizable. And Jeremy Hunt, who is the current foreign secretary. So it's going to be one of the 2 of them. The big issue, again, is Brexit. That's pretty much the one issue that anyone speaks or cares about in the UK, which is always a problem when it's a one-issue politics. So I believe they are having the final vote tomorrow, where they'll release the results.
Oh wow. Okay. Because I know that there's been a few prime ministers that they've been dealing with, and I haven't heard good things about the current one. Right. I haven't heard anything. But again, I'm not privy to all that. I don't know a lot of it. So yeah, that's why I really wanted to talk to you. And I think it's really important that. I think one thing as Americans that we tend to do is we only think of America, and we don't really care or know what's going on the outside, which is kind of important, because I think that you have this thing with the European Union, which I want to ask you about. But I feel like it's a lot with kind of what's going on with these democratic socialists and kind of what they want to do. Is they want pretty much a whole bunch of unions looking over everything. And so the people don't have much power anymore. Right, to where they want someone on the outside, at least on the outside of different situations, to kind of deal with what's going on as far as businesses, as far as their pay goes, or time the time they leave, and all this stuff. And I kind of feel that's what the European Union is in a sense. It kind of the people don't get to vote for them, but yet they get to make all these laws that they kind of just have to deal with. Right. So
I think you touched on a really good point. I think of Americans generally not learning as much about kind of the outside world. I think the blame for that falls quite squarely on the educational community, which I think is actually being quite an intentional decision. Because I think if you don't learn about world history as well as American history, and you don't learn about American history through a positive lens, you only see it through a negative lens. You only ever see the negative parts of American history. You don't see the positive elements, but you also don't see kind of any. You're not provided with any perspective on why America is such a fantastic place to live. Every country has issues. Especially in their history, every country has problems.
Yeah.
But when you don't look at, say, the horrors that communism and radical socialism have brought to the world, then you have no idea as to why the suggestions being put forward today are quite so terrifying.
Yeah.
You don't see why such a focus on individualism rather than anything else is so important and so rare in the world. And so there are so many elements of American life and American politics that people are intentionally made ignorant of through no fault of their own, which leads them to fall for people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, who come out and say all these wonderful things. And often it's the first time people have heard these things.
Yeah.
But if you just read a couple of history books that aren't put through a far less lens, and you'll see that, these things have been said for hundreds of years, and they are fundamentally immoral, but also never work.
Yeah, exactly. Like I was talking to someone the other day, or just today at work, I was talking with another guy. He has his master's in history. And we're talking about Abraham Lincoln, who most people in America love him because he, abolished slavery. But in reality, like, he straight up like removed habeas corpus. That's like pretty bad. Like, yeah, you could take just put someone in jail without having them go to court, like without trying them. You can just like throw them in jail. It's like, dude, like in like his real like motive behind it and the whole Emancipation Proclamation. And so but when I was in school, I was just told North good, South bad, North won, slaves are free. And that's like all we're taught. Like we don't learn about, the British and the West Indies and in Australia. Like we don't learn about any of that stuff, and that's like, I understand like world history. So like when you hear something like the AOC or like the Bernie Sanders, like what is being promoted these days on the left, and this changing of language from manhole to whatever, like
the manhole thing in Berkeley is the most ridiculous thing I've heard the last couple of days.
it's just like, wait, what? Like that's just language, and like the offensiveness and all. So like once you begin to see the bigger picture, like this just sounds silly. So like that's why so many conservatives are like, this is silly. Like this is like it's, but then the left's like, no, it's not. Like you're not compassionate or whatever. So but like. So like European Union, like what exactly is its function? Like what does it do? And my natural assumption is that it's not good. Like I don't like unions anyway. I'm not a union guy. So just hearing that, I'm just like, ugh.
So it's not a union as a trade union would be. It's really it's an umbrella term for an ever-growing bureaucracy that really, in my opinion, is aimed in destroying all sense of individual nation. The idea of individual nationhood within Europe. And so I think it's very important looking at Europe to see it in the context of post-World War II. There are a lot of people very concerned about the return of World War, but specifically, European war. And so there were quite a few things done to try and I wouldn't say generate peace, but to put the system in place that would guarantee peace as greatly as possible. And so a lot of people thought that the kind of looking at this through an economic lens would be the way to go. And so the European Union began as what developed into a single market. And so effectively people were free to trade across Europe with a set of single rules that everyone shared, which just sounds like a free trade agreement, which most people were on board for. So in the 70s, the UK actually had a referendum, I believe, for this and voted in favor of it. Which is fine. If it had stopped there, I think most people would have been. Free trade is a generally good thing.
Yeah.
The problem is that it grew from a purely economic agreement to become a political and legislative agreement, and then it became an issue of a government overarching other governments with a huge amount of power over laws that affected every single country. You had the issue of the euro currency that was brought in that the UK, thank goodness, didn't adopt. But then you've got a common currency across other many countries, some of which can basically manipulate that currency for their own gains. You've got some countries who are export exporting countries who have benefited hugely because then they, using the same currency, can develop products in other countries for kind of a artificially lower cost, and all kinds of quite interesting things that are way beyond my understanding, but aren't good for the countries who are being used.
Yeah.
So really, it's grown beyond what it ever was meant to be, and I think that's what most people who are anti-European Union feel, is that it's this sense of this kind of globalist view, which I'm sure people in the US are also familiar with. We're all citizens of the world, and that kind of what I think is absolute rubbish. It's absurd. We're not. You can't be citizens of the world. There are other countries. Other countries have different cultures. There is such a thing as different countries with different viewpoints.
Yeah.
And so it's an attempt to erase all that in favor of a European state, effectively. The European Union has its own flag, its own anthem, has its own currency, and it's incredibly powerful. And to some extent, there's a huge kind of population of lawmakers who aren't elected. It's this really uncontrollable bureaucracy that's grown beyond all recognition and is so involved in every part of every country's life that the very notion of leaving was almost an impossible task, which is why Brexit has been such a mess. Because it's you're so deeply ingrained within the European Union. It's not something you can just cut cleanly and walk away from. But in my opinion, at least, I feel like the European Union grew way beyond what it was meant to. But this is the result of every single bureaucracy and every single kind of political system that doesn't value individualism, that doesn't value, I don't want to say nationalism because I don't really like the breadth of that term, but doesn't value the patriotism of each country, the different values of each country. I mean, just talking about the European Union and saying, like, oh, we're all one and the same, there are distinct differences between each country.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it be cultural, historical, you can't just merge all of these cultures together. I think it's almost the ultimate example of when you try and force cultures together and pretend there aren't going to be any adverse effects, you're really fooling yourself.
Yeah.
So yeah, overall, I know that was quite a waffly answer, but the European Union really has just grown beyond what it was meant to in the start, which was an economic union, has grown beyond that to an almost unrecognizable size.
Okay. All right. So then you have Brexit,
Mm-hmm.
which you did mention how you guys kept your own currency because you guys, apart from what the European Union wanted, you guys still have your own currency, which was something that, did other countries do that as well? Or was that just something?
I believe a handful of countries didn't. It was a separate system. There was a lot of pressure to join the euro. I remember it was in, I believe, the late 90s or early 2000s. So I was quite young, but I vaguely remember it. Okay. And luckily, the UK kept hold of their own currency. Yeah. I mean, the UK and London specifically is one of the financial centers, if not the financial center in the world. So to get rid of your currency would be idiotic. But really, the currency was just another claw that could be dug into your country. I mean, can you imagine going back from one currency to another? It would just be, it would be like just changing away from the dollar. It's just, it's an impossible task.
Yeah, no, that would be bad.
So Brexit was the result of almost decades of pressure from within certain areas of British politics to leave the European Union. It had been going on for quite a few years. You'd have some parties, such as the UK Independence Party, which is a quite far-right party with elements of some of the nasty areas of conservatism, which sort of people like you and I aren't going to be fans of. But their general goal was to leave Europe. And you had some other parties too. So eventually, with this growing pressure, David Cameron called a referendum with the question of, do you want to leave or remain in the European Union? Yeah. So I believe this was the mandate for the 2015 election for the Conservatives. The Conservatives won that election, and so they put forward the referendum question in June, I think 23rd of 2016. And people voted, I believe, I wrote it down, 51.9% voted to leave, which is quite a close result, but it was also one of the highest turnouts in British voting history. I think over 70% turned out for it, which compare that to US elections is huge. Yeah. And then ever since then, nothing much has happened. So it's there's been quite a few issues of failing to reach an agreement with the European Union, which describes how the split would work. There's been a lot of issues. I'm sure you might have heard about the backstop issue with Northern Ireland, of dealing with the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, because the Republic of Ireland is a member of the EU, and
Yeah.
the fact that most politicians voted, or at least in favor of remaining. So Theresa May wanted to remain in the EU. She voted to remain in the EU, and yet she was the prime minister who was tasked with leaving the EU. So it's I don't want to project her lack of motivation without evidence, but if you were to be told that the person who voted against something is now in charge of doing it, that doesn't fill me with confidence that they're about to deliver. So
yeah, no, definitely
quite
not.
a mess.
Yeah. Okay, so it's been what? How many years is that now? 3, 4 years now?
Yeah, over 3 years.
Over 3 years. Yeah, of you guys like voting for it, but then nothing has happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so so Parliament voted to begin the process of leaving, and then it became this negotiating period with the EU to put forward what they call a withdrawal agreement, which sets out all the terms and conditions to agree to leave and basically to allow us to have time to develop a long-term trading plan. The problem with the withdrawal agreement is that the members of Parliament rejected it 3 times. It's very complex, so I think we don't really have time to go into it. But there were quite a few issues with the agreement that really betrayed the core underlying purpose of Brexit. So it left, for example, Northern Ireland effectively as a member of the EU, which, as Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, betrays an entire part of the United Kingdom in many ways. It would involve a lump payment of £39 billion to the EU to kind of pay for what we had promised to pay, which is quite a lot of money for any country, and sort of a bunch of other parts which just weren't supported by any member of Parliament. Really, the big problem, though, is when you hear people talk about Brexit, you'll often hear people say, talk about a no-deal Brexit. So a no-deal Brexit is a split from the European Union with no underlying agreement. So it's just tomorrow we are no longer part of the European Union. Every single agreement we have with them is null and void, and then we move on from there. Most of the politicians working towards a withdrawal agreement came out and said, we don't want a no-deal Brexit. That is the worst thing we can imagine. I think many of them voted in favor of avoiding a no-deal Brexit at all costs, which puts you at quite a bad position if you're actually trying to negotiate a deal. It's like going to someone and say, okay, I'm buying a ring from my wife, but I've got to tell you, I'm not leaving without one, and then asking them to do you a good deal. It's not going to happen. So the European Union were definitely in a position of power the entire time, which ultimately comes down on Theresa May, and she has held on with her fingernail somehow for several years at this point. It's been really, really quite dreadful. So we just need to wait and see, I guess, if the next prime minister will almost certainly be Boris Johnson can do anything different. But he has his own problems. He has somewhat of a Trump-esque image that's being applied to him by a lot of the UK media, and so that can cause quite a lot of division too, on top of the existing Brexit division, which is quite toxic for the country. It really is terrible. It's there have been friendships that have been broken up by Brexit, family dinners that have just been spoiled by Brexit. It really is a cross-country issue that's I think everyone is ready for it to be done, but whether or not it will, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, we have to definitely wait and see. And it makes more sense for you to describe it more like the 2016 election here, because that's exactly what happened, right? Yep. Like people have cut off family members and friends, lifelong friends probably even, and that's what's so tragic. It's like, look, like this is a serious thing, but like our day-to-day lives are way more important than any political thing.
Yeah, the comparisons are quite amazing if you look into it. So for example, the attitude towards people who voted leave after the election. So quite often, if you hear someone voted for Trump, regardless of what you think of him, there are legitimate and illegitimate reasons to vote for him. And similarly for Brexit, there are legitimate and illegitimate reasons. But quite often you'll hear people who usually are voting for Remain saying that people voted for Leave because they hate immigrants. They're under it all deeply racist. They're deeply nationalistic. It's exactly the same kind of rhetoric. There's the complete, almost intellectual arrogance to dismiss any view that is counter to yours, which really is a problem that has dominated the Remain camp. So you'll see people pushing for another referendum because people didn't quite understand the question in the first place. It really does blow my mind sometimes the way one side of politics tends to be talking about the illegitimacy of democracy over and over again, and yet they are the ones trying to undermine it by basically taking every result they are not happy with and destroying its validity somehow.
Yeah.
So the comparisons are really quite amazing. It's really, especially both happening in 2016, both equally divisive. Really, some would argue that the vote to leave the European Union is more impactful than Donald Trump, because Donald Trump will leave in either a couple of years or in 2024, whereas the European Union is pretty much a nation-defining decision. So
yeah,
it's very interesting from a distance, but also quite depressing if you see the impact it's having on just day-to-day society.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, hey, no, thank you so much. And we're obviously going to talk again. And I'm going to start reading more about it. And I'm sure if you ever see anything, you can send me a message on Instagram. Just let me know. It's like, hey, check out this. This is really interesting. This will help you better understand it. And I'm always like more than willing to read stuff and learn. So, but Ian, thank you so much.
Oh, no worries. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely. And hey, don't forget to go over to his YouTube channel. I'll leave a link in the description below. Find Ian on Instagram, on YouTube, on Twitter, on whatever you can. He does do some writing for the Daily Wire he's done before, and some other some conservative news outlets in the past. So definitely go find his things, they're all found on your website, yeah? All your articles and stuff.
If you go to my website, which is www.ighaworth.com, I have links to all my podcast episodes, all my appearances on other shows, all my articles so I've written for the Daily Wire, the Federalist, townhall.com, and a bunch of other places. So it's all there. It's probably the best place to start.
All right. So, so if you're watching this, go check them out. But Ian, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.